The following Patreon episode is brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Here to tell you why it's important to become a patron is our favorite guest, Cam Mallow. Cam, why should they become a patron?
It's important to help bring more new episodes.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks, Cam. So if you want to become a patron, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and become one today. We thank you in advance.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode here. And today we're talking with Steve Phan. Right, Bob?
That's right. He's fantastic. Did I beat you to it again?
Yeah, but like that's a weird twist on the timeline there because I said it first, but they're going to hear you say it first. So it's just strange.
An inception level
like
introduction
pushing
now.
Your buttons, Matt. I just love it. I live for it.
Anyway, Steve Phan, a lot of people know, you follow him on Facebook or Instagram and everything. He works down at the Civil War Defenses of Washington out in Washington, D.C. And he was up here doing a winter lecture today about the Civil War Defenses of Washington and the Gettysburg campaign. Bob and I went to see it, and there we met a young chap named Cameron.
Yes.
Cameron Sauers.
Yep,
All
that's right.
And Cameron, you go to Gettysburg College.
Correct.
You are a fellow at the Civil War Institute.
That's correct.
Okay, I was going to say, because you don't look like a lady.
You're not even a dad.
Capital F in fellow there.
Yeah, I'm not even a dad, exactly. That was a dad joke. I'm at that age, though. It's really not. You don't have to be a dad to do a dad joke. You just have to be
It's
over
a state
40.
of mind.
Yeah, it is. And you, I guess you know Steve.
Yeah, Steve and I go back about 2 years to my freshman year of college. I met Steve at a conference. Since then, we've bumped into each other a lot of places, and I always hit him up when he's in Gettysburg.
All right. And so you were at the lecture, and you and I got to talking, and I said, you know what, chum, why don't you come by the studio? You could sit in with us and everything. So people, you may hear his voice, and you wonder, who the hell is this? Well, that's who it is. It's Cameron. And what did we talk about? Well, first of all, Steve's worked for the National Park Service for about 5 years now, total. And I asked him what were his favorite parks, and he said, well, definitely Gettysburg. And then he paused, and he said, and Chickamauga, and Antietam. And he started naming a lot of them, because we have a lot of awesome parks here in the United States. But he does love himself some Gettysburg. And, yeah, I mean, we just sat down and started talking with him, and then eventually moved into the Civil War Defenses of Washington. And I found that very interesting because that's something you don't really hear a lot about. You don't really read a lot about. I never really was interested in it until today.
Yeah, there were quite some significant units contributing to the battle here, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he told us about the Vermonters.
Standards Brigade.
So that's how we pronounce it. He pronounced it a little differently.
Stenard.
Yeah.
That's like Stunard.
I've always said Standards Brigade,
Yeah.
who fired into the right of Pickett's division. The Pennsylvania Reserves.
Two brigades from there.
Yeah, from the Washington defenses. Lockwood's Brigade that had been over there at Culp's Hill and then moved over to the Union left. Let's see.
Stahl's Cavalry.
Oh, yeah. Kilpatrick commanding here at Gettysburg. And the Harper's Ferry Cowards.
Willard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Willard's Brigade on the second,
Yeah.
and also defending on the third day against Pettigrew's division. But yeah.
So, I mean, imagine if any one of them weren't attached to Hooker's army and eventually Meade's army, like how this would have turned out.
Yeah.
You know? Who would have been in Willard's place on the second day? Who would have lost his head that day?
Oh, boy.
What? He did.
Time to get started learning about Gettysburg.
Let's get over. Let's get over to us talking with our buddy Steve Phan. He is fantabulous.
Good job, man.
No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Okay, let's get on with this fandango. Okay, that's it. I got it. So normally we just kind of like we're just talking, and then
fun.
So let me jump in here if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Steve, tell us how you first got interested in being a ranger. Did you get your diaper changed one day and you're like, hey, that's what I want to be. I want to be a park ranger.
I get this question a lot because I do so much public programming, give tours and talks, and it really started back in Colorado. That's where I'm originally from, and I was like, I think a lot of young boys that are interested in military history, playing with the plastic soldiers, getting into G.I. Joes and watching, action flicks and stuff like that. And I remember in third grade, I was sitting in class. Our teacher came into the room and was like, does anyone know what the Civil War was? We don't really talk about it in Colorado and history too much. And even in our U.S. history, I guess we lightly covered it and none of us knew. And he's like, I'm going to go out and show you. And so he took us outside, and we had what we call these Civil War buffs, and I'm doing this in quotes, come to our school, and they dressed up the fifth graders to do a reenactment outside of our school. And I was in awe. And I was in third grade, right? So awesome. You had to be in fifth grade to do it. The next year, I was in fourth grade. My brother was in fifth grade, and he came home with his Confederate uniform on. They're making cartridges out of flour, and they're making bayonets out of tinfoil. I'm like, this is the coolest thing ever. So around that time, I watched Gettysburg, I watched Glory, I read Killer Angels, right? And as I was going through into college, my plan was to be like a high school history teacher and coach sports. But the further I got into history, I'm like, man, I want to keep on diving deeper and deeper. I heard about the Gettysburg, what they called the semester program under Dr. Alan Gelzo. That's when I came out here in 2012. That's really my first time to see a Civil War battlefield. I've been waiting my entire life to do that. Introduced to the Park Service. I interned at the battlefield here in Special Collections, and it was a life-changing experience.
So your first battlefield that you visited was here.
That's why this place is so special to me, because I know there's a lot of people in the Civil War field that are like, it's always Gettysburg. People always talk about Gettysburg, but I'm like, but it's Gettysburg. Yeah. So I feel that to my core. It's a part of who I am as a Civil War historian. I'm very connected to this site. So
is Colorado still home?
No, I live in Washington, D.C. now.
You do now, right?
Yes,
but
that's right.
Your folks or something?
Yeah, I still got family back in Colorado. Okay. But I was born and raised in Denver, diehard, Broncos fan, as all my friends know. But, I remember... actually, when I was doing the program here, talking to Dr. Peter Carmichael, who we all know, and I remember him asking me, he's like, do you want to make the Civil War your career? I'm like, that'd be awesome, right? Yeah. That'd be great. And he's like, and literally, these were his exact words. He's like, then you'll have to leave your beloved Colorado. That was his exact words to me, right? So I actually ended up going to graduate school in Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro because Stones River National Battlefield is by the school. Right. I wanted to be near a battlefield during my time in graduate school, so that was that's the reason why I chose it.
Did you ever go down to Santa Fe area, Glorieta Pass?
Oh, absolutely,
because
yes.
Coloradans were fighting.
That's right.
Yeah,
there was the
Colorado
Volunteers there, of course. I have yet to go out to Sand Creek. In November of 1864, but they're obviously the
Shivington massacre.
The third Colorado. I mean, they were called the Bloodless until after that, the massacre. But they were present at the battle as well. So, in regards to the Civil War, that's what we really talk about in Colorado. We'd mention the Sand Creek massacre a bit, lightly talk about the Civil War, but unlike being in Virginia or Pennsylvania or Maryland or any area around here. It's, we're just not deeply connected, right? There's not people say, we've owned this property for 150 years, or I've had, many, many answers that served in both armies. Like, it's not like that out in Colorado.
So for you, the Civil War Institute was sort of a gateway into the National Park Service because it came out here first.
The Institute and the college. I was working with Dr. Alan Gelzo, and he took us to battlefields every single weekend, and it was an incredible experience. I got to meet park rangers and make really wonderful, not only connections, but friendships now. Right, a lot of these people are my really close friends now. And every weekend we went out to, we went to Manassas, and we went to Harper's Ferry. We went to Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, and went all over the place. And I didn't know that there was Civil War forts in D.C. managed by the Park Service. So, I mean, that just worked out when I was doing a seasonal during graduate school, and it's led to this this job, and I'm very, very fortunate.
A lot of people don't realize that one of the other facets to you is your love of food.
Indeed.
You are, I guess we would call you a foodie.
I am very proud of that.
Let me interject that this young man, and I'm old, is not in any way
overweight.
No, not at all.
He's not.
I've got very fortunate. I've got good genes in my family, I would say. So,
yeah. So if you follow him on Instagram or Facebook or anywhere, there's probably just as many pictures of you smiling broadly in front of a plate of food than there are of you in front of a can.
Generally, several plates of food.
Yeah. So. I will say, having eaten at buffets and
right into the mic, Cameron, into the end.
Eating at the Gettysburg College dining hall with Steve, and eating at some Golden Corral buffets scattered near Civil War battlefields. Steve's public history work is not nearly as impressive as his ability to put away plates and plates and plates of food.
That's my greatest honor.
One of the many starving college students that exists, and I cannot come anywhere close to Steve's food. So his Instagram...
You're starving because he's eating all the food.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes. His Instagram food pictures are marked by both quality and quantity. That's right. That's really what's worth checking out.
That's what it's all about. And I'm living in D.C., it's so food rich. It's so diverse. There's people from all over the world. There are different cuisines. So I live in a house with people from all over the country, and there's people from all over the world in my house. So we generally go to a new restaurant almost every week.
Nice. So, Steve, why don't you tell us something about Cameron, whose voice just magically appeared.
Cameron is who. We just picked Cameron up. He's like a stray dog.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I figured.
In and the door was ajar, and so I came in.
Well, Cameron's, I guess I'm going to be really nice, to be honest. He's been very impressive. I remembered I'm a part of the parks that participate in the Phanka Fellowship, right?
Yeah.
Where we take in interns for the summer at these national park sites all over the country. And one of the things I remarked to Dr. Carmichael and his staff was, I really did enjoy coming back the second year and seeing the same students and seeing how much they've grown. And you can see it in the way they interview and the way they really formulate their thoughts. And I think a lot of them many of them, including Cameron, had done internships with the Park Service. I'd spent 3 months working with Park Service doing frontline stuff and seeing how we interpret and we manage sites and how we interact with visitors and talk about really difficult topics. And when he interviewed, and was that November or October?
Yeah, right around then.
It was incredibly impressive. I'd seen how much he's grown as a young historian and as a young professional. So you hear a lot that young people aren't interested in history anymore, and maybe the numbers are a little bit down, but I don't believe the interest level in regards to the individual people has gone down at all.
No,
right?
No.
I mean, it's quite impressive. So I really did enjoy that. That's my favorite aspect of it, because I think a lot of us in that room that were, professional historians, a lot of us, obviously, most of us worked for the Park Service, could say, I remember being an intern and walking into this room, and it's kind of scary. There's like 12 people in uniform. They're asking you questions, and you're just, you're going to have to answer them on the spot. And so it's difficult, but I think just to watch the students grow has been quite impressive. And I think for us, it shows that, we're doing an effective job and that we need to continue to develop these young people.
And I think what you do as far as your social media presence helps too. You're someone for them to focus on and kind of look up to, those that don't actually get to meet you and everything. There's someone that they can see and they're like, you know what? I could do this too. Like, this guy's fun. What's with the uniform? Like, you have a different uniform than all the other guys in the Park Service.
It's the famous Ike jacket that you could pull out once or twice a year, depending on, if you do a cool program. And so, I wanted to pull it out. I think, which I appreciate you saying, my approach to this is, each individual person has their own style,
right?
And so be yourself, have your own personality, and approach it the way that you believe should be approached. But there should also be substance behind it as well, right?
Sure.
People should know that you've done the research, that you understand the deep, complex history, that you understand context. Mm-hmm. Context is so important, right? And that's why I think that because I run our social media pages for our Civil War sites, right? And it's been quite effective because I think we take people to where they want to see, share new things that they might not have heard of, and offer events and programming that adhere to a changing demographic and changing what people want, right? So I'll give you an example. One of the things I do in D.C. with the forts is when I give a tour around the Capitol forts, Cameron's been on my tours before, I always specifically say, enjoy history in nature. Come out and enjoy. I mean, in Washington, D.C., we've got like Rock Creek Park, right? We've got this amazing urban oasis in the middle of the federal Capitol. And like, come out. It's a beautiful area. You get some exercise, get to learn about the area, and learn about really cool history subjects and stuff that still pertinent to what's going on
and
today.
Apparently there's what was 100-pound parrots, or were those the Columbiads that were in the woods?
Oh, that's Fort Foote. Yeah, we've got these 15-inch Rodman guns they're right in the middle of the woods, and we're actually doing a major project there to put in brand new waysides that will be coming out this year. And have they been sitting there since the war? Yeah, so Fort Foote is actually one of the sites that was actually kept around after the war, and it's dramatically important, critically important, in the evolution of coastal defenses. And the reason why I say that is because that was put right on the Potomac River to protect the Capitol from the Confederate Navy. If an ironclad, gunship cruised up the Potomac River to shell the city, those guns could penetrate armor. And the reason why they kept that site around is because of foreign navies. A foreign navy could roll up the Potomac River. So let's have these massive guns on top of the river, and we'll figure out what to do next. So they experimented with concrete out there. They experimented with depressing carriages for the cannons, a little bit of everything. They had these granite blocks where they mounted the guns on. But by the mid-1870s, Congress was like, what's the Army doing out here? And they're like, we're trying to figure it out. And they said, well, we're not going to pay for this anymore. So a lot of the testing went up to like the harbors around New York.
Okay.
But this is a precursor to the Endicott battery systems from the 1890s into the early 1900s that we see dotting the coastline.
Okay.
Right?
Like up at Sandy Hook, like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So think about all those reinforced concrete batteries, those guns with the disappearing guns.
Yeah,
that's the precursor to that, because that's why they're experimenting with the depressing carriages and this kind of loose concrete. If you go out to the fort, you can see they've got these concrete magazines out there. They were just experimenting with this stuff after the war. It's really, really interesting. And so there's you can make a connection of the evolution of fortifications right there. It's really cool.
So let's get into then the defenses of Washington then. Describe to us 1861, war begins. What's Washington, D.C. like before the forts go up? What do we got?
It's a great question. It's there's an author or historian that writes about this in her book in the 1930s called like Reveille in Washington. She wins the Pulitzer Prize for this, and she says Washington D.C. is Southern by nature. It's surrounded. The character of the city is Southern, which actually makes a lot of sense. She calls it like a temporary station where politicians come out from 2 to 4 to 6 years and then they leave. Right. People don't stay there permanently. It's a relatively small town. There's less than 100,000 people there. I think I'm trying to remember. I don't want to be 60 or so thousand people that reside in the Capitol or around the Capitol before, in 1861. There was one fort around called Fort Washington. There was an original fort there built before the War of 1812. And if you know anything about Washington D.C. in the War of 1812, it didn't do a very good job of protecting the city.
Right.
I noticed they extended the defenses up to Bladensburg.
Absolutely.
Right? Because of the War of 1812.
Absolutely. And when the war began, apparently there was an ordnance sergeant and just a bunch of cannons and munitions out there. That's all there was. Maybe a complement, I believe, of United States Marines. That was it. And so, but the fort's located too far south of the city. So just like you were talking about Bladensburg, but the immediate threat was Virginia.
Right.
And so I plan to give a program the Park Service has been doing this major rehab project of the Arlington House, right? The Lee property. Yeah. And one of my favorite things to do in Washington, D.C. or the area is to go up to Arlington National Cemetery in front of the Lee House and look north across the Potomac River. I mean, you can see everything, right? It's one of the best views of the Capitol, and they call that rightfully so, or appropriately, Arlington Heights.
Right.
So that's why I said in my program, when the Army had been reconnoitering around the area for weeks, right, and coming up with a plan to protect the city, and Barnard's a lieutenant colonel, I believe, at that point, and he's reporting to actually Joseph Mansfield, who's mortally wounded at Antietam, and he tells him, he's like, hey, if something happens with Virginia, we need to seize the initiative and cross the river and
deprive them of that good ground.
It makes sense because all the Confederate Army needed to do was roll up artillery and they could shell the Capitol, right? So Mansfield actually tells Winfield Scott this, who was actually recalled from New York City by James Buchanan. Outgoing James Buchanan says, hey, I want to make sure you ensure the safe and peaceful transfer of power from me to Lincoln, right? So Winfield Scott's called back, and he's like, all right, we're going to ensure that Lincoln's inaugurated as safely, and we also want to protect the Capitol. So when they hear that Virginia will secede from the Union, that evening, literally, in the pitch of night, the Army will cross the river, and they'll occupy Arlington, including the Lee property, and then some elements of the Union Army will shift down towards, or the United States Army will shift down towards Alexandria, and the very next day they start building forts.
Wow.
So, Steve, one of the things I'm interested in is Arlington, in addition to that initial strategic importance it has. I recently read a book on the history of Arlington. It talked about Arlington becoming a vital place for African Americans and the establishment of the community there. To what extent does that kind of follow throughout the forts in terms of being a refuge for African Americans in Washington, D.C.?
Cameron, I think that's a wonderful question. And that's the thing that I've actually been spending a lot of my time researching, is because I've read articles and saying that 40 to 50,000 former African-American slaves or enslaved people came to the city as refugees during the Civil War. And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm like, where's this number coming from? I'm still trying to verify that. But I'm like, if they came to the city and then you hear about all these contraband camps around Washington, D.C., I'm like, they had to get through the forts first. You can't just walk into the city, right? By the end of 1861, there's 48 forts around the city, just encircling the city, right? That's why I call it, Fortress Washington. And this number will get larger and larger over the span of the war. But as early as, summer, into the fall and winter of 61, there are enslaved African Americans just running in the federal lines, right? So this interaction is first happening at the forts. And I'm like, all right, let's go to the regimental histories and see if some of the regimental histories are talking about this. And it's really interesting because in Virginia, they start, happily accepting him in because Virginia is in rebellion, right? So contraband of war thing is with Benjamin Butler and Fortress Monroe, the contraband decision, and that was supported by the administration and by Congress. The issue was Maryland. Maryland is still United States, right? It's a border state. It's not in rebellion, so the soldiers were told, like the Fugitive Slave Act is still in force. So if slaves come into your alliance and the owners pursue them, which happened quite a bit from the accounts I found, you're supposed to turn them back. You turn them over.
If they're from Maryland.
It's interesting because the accounts I read many times, the soldiers said no.
That they wouldn't do it.
They wouldn't do it. And so they started hiring on, especially the young men, as like camp servants and officers, assistants and stuff, like cooks and stuff like that. But I found accounts where the slave owner came into camp and was threatened by the soldiers, and the soldiers told him, if you ever come back here, like, you're not going to make it out. It's incredible.
Wow,
I'll have to share it with you another time. I did a program about it. And
we'd be happy to have you back to talk about it.
That's
awesome.
There was and I'll kind of give you a sneak peek about it, but there's one day the owner came in, he found his former slave, and he basically says, you're with me. And apparently the former slave says, no, I own myself now. He had the support of the soldiers. That night, there were dozens of men from their regiment that went north into Maryland and plundered slave owners throughout the night. Wow. And then they went to the same house of that slave owner, and with him and his wife were told to get on their knees and to swear allegiance to the Union. I mean, incredible, right? I cannot believe the account. And then, they took stuff from their barn and they fell back into camp that evening.
Really?
So kind of getting back to Cameron's questions. Yeah, I mean, we've got the Freedmen's Village over by Arlington National Cemetery. And so, what will become Arlington National Cemetery? So it's really interesting because it becomes humanitarian crisis for the federal government, right? 30, 40, 50,000 people coming from everywhere. Like, how do we support them? And so, you find a military use when they expand the forts starting in 1862. They actually call down to the Fort Monroe area to send up Contraband to work on the forts. And then and
then that's freeing up fighting men you can send to the front lines.
Absolutely. And it also provides, labor. So the labor that these people can support themselves, right? Kind of a thing. So a lot of the Contraband are finding employment as, obviously around anywhere connected with the Army, right? And by 1863, obviously they're enlisting in the Army. So I've done a program down at Theodore Roosevelt Island during the Civil War. It was called Mason's Island, right in the Potomac River. If you look directly across the river, it's Georgetown, and it was an Army camp for most of the war. And then the first United States colored troops were raised and organized on that island and then sent to Virginia. And then afterward, it became a contraband camp for over 1,000 formerly enslaved African Americans. So those stories are there, and they're just kind of waiting to be revealed and connected and shared with the public, right? So that's one of my major focuses.
So that young voice you heard is Cameron Sauer. Am I pronouncing
Sauers.
Yeah, sorry. Cameron Sauers. He is a junior at Gettysburg College and working with the Institute, I think.
Yes, I'm a fellow at the Civil War Institute, and I am our social media coordinator, too.
All right, and thank you do you have any more you wanted to ask Steve about the Arlington or anything else?
No, I mean, Steve is a good friend, and his work at the Civil War Defenses of Washington is a really good example to young historians like myself of what we can do in places and find interesting stories. So that will be my question is kind of, Steve, what's next on the horizons at the Civil War Defenses of Washington? You kind of revealed to the public a big project you've got going on. Is there anything else coming up the pipeline for you guys?
That's a great question. I think continuing, so we're very unique, and I want to explain to the listeners that we're not a separate park. The Civil War Defenses is actually a regional program within the capital area. So we work with 3 national parks in the region to maintain Civil War sites, these Civil War forts.
Which parks?
So Rock Creek Park, and including Fort Stevens, Fort Totten, Fort Bunker Hill, Fort Reno, and then across the Anacostia River is the southeast forts. The park is called National Capital Parks East. So when you think of National Capital Parks East, they also manage the Frederick Douglass House and Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. Okay. So we manage, the main fort we manage there is Fort DuPont. We have this summer concert series that goes back into late 1960s. That's really, really popular with the people in the community there. And then we also work with George Washington Memorial Parkway. Fort Marcy is just right off the GW Parkway. But they've also got sites down in Alexandria as well. And so kind of answer your question is to really work with all these, not only parks within these sites within the Park Service, but also just people within the community is really, really important as the neighborhoods are changing and demographics are changing, but also different organizations. So I've worked a lot with Arlington County because they manage some Civil War forts in Northern Virginia. And they manage Forts Ethan Allen and C.F. Smith. I suggest going down to see Fort C.F. Smith. They've got a new visitor center there that's open on the weekends, right? So it's really interesting to see how different entities manage sites, right? And do conservation and preservation and things like that. So my big thing is to continue to expand this as much as we can and connect visitors and the general public from everywhere to our stories, right? My big thing is there's just so many layers of stories that are just waiting to be revealed that have been there for so long that have either been untouched or have not been discovered yet, right? So
well, let's get into like the superficial story then to tell about the defenses of Washington. Yeah. First of all, explain to the audience the difference between a fort and a redoubt and a battery. I think everybody knows a battery, but Go ahead, explain that to us. And then after that, give us just an overview of were there any times during the war that the defenses were threatened or that there were fights that took place, et
Well,
cetera?
let's see. The forts, there were main forts, I call them major forts. So like that's the center of one of the defensive positions, right? And a lot of them were shaped like star forts that people may have seen before, like the stone star forts. They literally built these forts out of earth. We call them earthworks for a reason. Mm-hmm. They came in there, they cut down trees, generally on the highest point of a hill, overseeing a main road or canal or some approach to the city. And they started piling up dirt and built these really, really big walls called parapets and mounted really, really big guns. Okay. And then over the course of the war, they started adding things like redoubts and batteries, which was pretty simple. They were artillery positions, right? They might not be fully enclosed like a main fort was. They might not have all the sides as a fort would. So like a
three-sided...
Yeah, a redoubt would be like a three-sided... Look, think about like a D shape, all right? Mm-hmm. And so the straight line is the rear of the fort.
Right.
And the curve would be the front of it.
Yeah, okay, gotcha.
And with all the guns there, right? So the duty or the job of the batteries was to cover all the blind spots between the forts, right? Mm-hmm. And to provide more of artillery fire against the enemy that was approaching, that you could see in the countryside. They cut down trees across the countryside, and they ranged their guns. And so, as the Confederate Army found out, answer your second question, in 1864, the second they got within 3 to 4 miles of Washington, D.C., they're taking artillery fire.
Yeah, okay.
From that far away. We talked about the 100-pound Parrott rifles. They mounted 14 of them in Washington, D.C., maximum range of over 4 miles. So once you get in within 4 miles, they were taking artillery fire. And as I read at the end of the program today, I love reading that account from Jubal Early, right? Yeah. Writing to Robert E. Lee of what he saw when he got to D.C.
Right.
And it's such an incredible description of the forts.
Can you paraphrase that for people that weren't there?
Well, he says, his men were exhausted. They had just fought the Battle of Manassas on July 9th. They get outside D.C. on really the early afternoon of July 11th. And he sees this bristling system of forts. He says, every foot of ground is covered by a heavy crossfire of artillery. And there's palisades, there's abattis, the sharpened sticks in front of the forts outside of the ditch, right? And so the forts were built that way, 800 to 1,000 yards apart. The main forts. So if you're moving towards Fort Stevens, as the Confederate Army did on July 11th and 12th, they're taking fire from 3 or 4 different forts.
I think the term that struck me in the quote was, I think he said it's scientific.
Scientifically designed.
Scientifically designed.
So you got West Point trained engineers like Barnard who... this is what they're made for.
Yeah.
Right? They've been studying this for years and years and years, and
they've had years and years and years to improve upon them without being molested, right?
Exactly. So I think that's one of the most important things about this is the forts. They seem static because they're sitting in place, but the design and construction and armament changes over the course of the war, right? They add bigger guns. They add different walls to the forts. They enlarge them dramatically. I mentioned during the talk that Fort Stevens was almost doubled in size because this was after the Maryland campaign, and Barnard and the other chiefs of the Army inspected all the forts, and they said, wow, these aren't big enough.
Right.
We need to add bigger guns as well, because if the Confederate Army is coming, they're likely coming from Maryland, and they were absolutely right about that.
Steve, was there a similar concern after First Manassas or First Bull Run? Because it seems like the Army was pretty well... not much of a factor to prevent the Confederates as they advanced those 25 or so miles.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So, as I said, the forts were really started being built in May, right? And it was an occupying zone for the Army. They could move men and supplies across the river, protect the high ground. But the main idea was to get the Army out in the field, defeat the Confederate Army, and end the rebellion, right? That was the goal, as quickly as possible. But as you said, after the Battle of Manassas, they're retreating back towards Washington, D.C. And it's really interesting. There's I think, an order either given to Winfield Scott or written by him saying, actually, I think it was delivered to him saying that the Army is retreating to the protection of the fort's guns. So the forts were already, the 5 or 6 of them that were in place were already doing their job, right? When McClellan comes out a few days later, within the week, this is when he brings on Barnard and says, all right, we need to defend the city.
Okay.
So going into the late summer, into the fall of 61 is when the foundation of the forts are set, right? As I said, about 48 by the end of 1861. Mm-hmm. By the end of the war, there's 68 forts, 93 batteries or gun positions, 37 miles of earthworks, 30 miles of military roads connecting all the forts. You can move men and supplies, and literally over 800 artillery pieces.
Today, if you visited the parks, how many artillery pieces are still there, Civil War?
Well, that's a great question. And let's see. I would suggest if you go outside of NPS, go check out Fort Ward, right off 395. They've got not only a visitor center and a museum, they've got reconstructed earthworks. They're spectacular. I mean, that's exactly at its height. That's what the forts would have looked like, right? They've got the wooden planked, white painted planks that are pressed against the wall to reinforce the parapets, right? Mm-hmm. They've got the gun platforms. They've got all the doors of the magazines labeled. It's absolutely spectacular. So they got a bunch there. The number, I think it's different per site, right? In the National Park Service, surprisingly, and you'll laugh because I'm driving up here from D.C. and I get close to the battlefield and I just see nothing but cannons. And I'm like, I want all these cannons in Washington, D.C. We've got 2 30-pound Parrott rifle reproductions at Fort Stevens where the main battle happened at, right? It's interesting. You guys will appreciate this because I'm still trying to find out what happened to these guns. I found an image from 1964 for the centennial of Fort Stevens. And it's an incredible image, like someone's standing on top of the parapet looking across the fort, and every single gun platform has a cannon on it. So there's like 3 or 4 more guns. I'm not sure where they went. Been trying to go through the records to kind of find out where they're at, right? And then we got to talk about those Rodman guns at Fort Foote, right?
Yeah.
So, because I know you mentioned this earlier, I found images from the 1930s where they were not sitting on their carriages; they were just on the ground, right? And they're so big. There's really great images of like Boy Scouts hanging on them. And from what I've been told, I'm still trying to go through, find a more detailed report about this. They were sitting out there. The Army left them out there, 2 of them, and they were remounted by the Park Service in the 1970s.
So, and were those the ones that you said were 19,000 pounds?
49,000.
49,000.
49.
And so, okay, so in the Civil War, obviously they're using beasts of burden for these, but how many horses would it take to...
That's a great question. Actually,
how do they get them on the carriages?
There's an incredible photo that they captured over by the Treasury building of the 15-inch Rodman gun. It's either going to Fort Foote or it's going to Battery Rogers in Alexandria, and it's literally pulled by an oxen team of like 20 oxes on a cart. It's absolutely incredible. So, and I've been trying to look for this. The likely next step is down to the water, right? And they transported it to the water, and they had to haul it up by oxes, mules, whatever, up to the fort. And I'm still trying to figure out how they emplaced those things. Those things were absolutely massive.
Right, because then they got to get it off of the flatbed put it onto the carriage.
That's onto the carriage, and then these things are firing 400-pound rounds.
And that was the next question. How do they get those in? I mean, how many guys does it take to pick up a round?
The crew on the, I mentioned on the 100-pounder was like close to 20 guys.
Yeah, I think you said 17,
right? 17, that's right. Probably similar number, but they also had these like hooks and cranes that they could move the rounds up and down. There's actually some pretty cool diagrams the Army made about how to load these things.
But are they doing it manually, or was it like mechanized for the day? Today they have it's all machines.
Yeah, for sure. I think for the day you would say it was mechanized. Yeah.
Okay. So they had some kind of like pulley system.
Pulley system. That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Steve, you were talking about kind of the history of the forts after they were the forts. Yeah. The guns are still left there. And Fort Stevens, I remember when I was lucky enough to be able to tour that site with you, has an interesting preservation history, if I recall correctly, in that it's revitalized after the war period. Is that correct? Am I correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, there's still a legacy of that around the entire city. It's really cool. And that's one of the things I like to mention to visitors on my programs is just the importance of names. One of the photos I always mention or forts I talk about is Fort Totten, because in Washington, D.C., everyone thinks of the Totten Metro Station. The fort's still on top of the hill. It's named Fort Totten after the fort, and Totten was the chief engineer of the Army. He was revered by the engineers. The guy had been in the service for over 40 years. by the time the Civil War began. He actually passes away in 1864. But he was integral into the development of the third system forts, like Fort Pulaski and Sumter and all that stuff, right? But that's why names are so important. So one of the things you'll notice around Washington, D.C. are the street signs called Fort Drive. So this plan or idea was initiated in the 1890s. And the idea was to create this boulevard around Washington, D.C. They wanted it to be comparable to the avenues of like Paris, right? Where you like ride out with your carriage and you go from site to site and enjoy history and nature, right?
Okay.
So the idea was called Fort Drive. That was the plan to connect the forts from Northwest Washington all the way across the Anacostia River. And really interesting, I mean, so if you go around, you'll see signs that say Fort Drive. A lot of it's on park property. The government started purchasing these properties in the 1930s. Okay, they could never fully fund the project because there's not one road that can take you from site to site. But the blueprint is there, I would say, right? So, yeah, they started purchasing these properties in the 1930s. And we've got this. So all the forts that we have, about 17 of them, make this loop around the city. And I say that's Fort Drive, right? It was never fully realized, but the legacy is still there. As you're talking about, you guys will appreciate this, all the history people, well, Fort Stevens, there's video footage of Fort Stevens in the early 1930s, and there's not much there. The walls are really just a couple piles of dirt. The veterans of the battle had dedicated a monument there to Abraham Lincoln, survivors of the 6th Army Corps, who were sent up to secure the city and involved in the battle there. But there was the monument there. There was a big boulder taken off the battlefield. They added a plaque in 1920, but that was about it. The walls were pretty much gone. And you can see this footage in the 1930s. It's really incredible because there's not much there. And then by 1937, the CCC is sent in and they rebuild the fort, at least a portion of it. So think about, Great Depression, right? New Deal, FDR stuff. I mean, that's all there. So they took 2 years or so to work on this, and we have a huge section of the fort that was rebuilt by the CCC. Incredible story.
So the forts actually play a role in the Gettysburg campaign.
They do.
What would that be?
So I think the big idea of what we're talking about today is not only sending troops to the Army of the Potomac, right? There was, I give specific examples of that to reinforce the Army, but the idea that, especially from the engineering standpoint, that the Union Army was really the first line of defense for the capital, right? And Barnard specifically says, like, we have a lot of forts and we have a lot of guns, but we also need the Army of the Potomac to be in front of this to make sure the city is secure. And
real quick, explain who Barnard is for the listeners.
Chief John G. Barnard. He becomes the chief engineer of the defenses of Washington, and he's highly regarded as one of the most brilliant engineers in the Army. As I said, he was around D.C. in early spring when he made the recommendation that they secure the high ground across the river in Arlington. And then he's brought on by George McClellan when George McClellan takes over to oversee the construction and design of the fort. So he's very, very important because anytime there's a threat to the city, they send him back to be like, hey, because he travels with McClellan down to the peninsula, right? And then when Robert E. Lee launches his Northern Virginia campaign, fights Second Manassas and then Ox Hill or Chantilly, they send Barnard back to the city to take command of troops and some of the defenses, right? So he was very hard to please, but he understood, I think more clearly than anyone, that the forts were there to kind of be a deterrent in many ways. You see the forts, but you also need the Army around to defeat the main force of the enemy, right? So as I described it, a symbiotic relationship. I mean, one works with the other, right? Yeah. So as I talked about today, the Army Potomac commanders were assigned command really of the defenses. It was a part of their duties, even though they could be fighting all the way down in Virginia or towards Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. They still had to keep in the back of their mind D.C. And that was finally separated in February of '63. I guess that's before Chancellorsville, but and they created an entire new department and an entirely new corps, the 22nd Corps, so they could basically operate separately, officially. But, the duties of the Army of the Potomac commander was always to think about D.C. as well, right? And so when you have Grant coming out in 1864 as general-in-chief and lieutenant general, that changes. And that's why it's so interesting to see the fort stripped of the men, right? Because I was reading the numbers that they suggested that D.C. had to have 25,000 infantry, at least 25,000. And you want at least 9,000 heavy artillerymen because they're specifically trained to fire their really big guns.
Right.
They've been ranging them out. They know how to properly clean and equip them and man them and operate them. We need those guys in the forts. And they had a lot of them. They had over 20,000 heavy artillerists just in case. And the majority of them will be sent down to reinforce Grant in 64. So it's interesting when Early's making his dash towards D.C., Halleck is asking Grant to send the heavies back. We need the guys to man the guns, right? Because they're not here anymore. Right. It's really interesting to see that the evolution of the defenses, because the forts change, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, according to what happens on the battlefield, right? So the forts were in decent shape. There was a lot of forts, over, almost 50 of them by the time the Maryland campaigns begins, right? But after, they're like, oh my gosh, Lee could really march down south and attack from Maryland. We need to add more forts. We need to make them bigger. We need to put more guns in them. We need to put more men in the forts. And then, with the 63 campaign, I think that just reaffirms the fact that what we suggested and recommended to the forts, that's the reason why we're doing this.
And it's not every fort isn't fully manned, right? It's basically is the idea that if, let's say, the Confederates are attacking wherever it is that they're attacking, then every floods to that area.
And a great example is that, like, the heavy artillery units, right? We read about the heavies that go down to participate in the Overland campaign. These units are like 1,400 to 1,600 men, like huge regiments, right? They're never that size in D.C. because they'll take a company and they'll separate companies between the forts. So some of the forts, the average garrison of a fort was maybe 200 guys. Okay. So the forts themselves were all garrisoned. The batteries themselves, a lot of the batteries were not armed. They were kept unarmed. The idea is you have gun emplacements in there. When the enemy approaches the city, you move up light artillery, and then you fill them in, right? So
this would be equivalent to the artillery we're seeing here, not those 49,000.
No, not at all. Think about the artillery reserve and how much an effect they had on the battle here, especially from the Army of Potomac perspective, right? Hey, send guns this way, right? We can do that. I mean, there's so many. The federal arsenal was in D.C., so there are cannons all over the place.
Well, now, okay, so then let's get back to here. So Gettysburg, how does the fort play in? The Hooker, is he allowed to take any troops from the fort, or what's going on with that?
Yeah, so I mentioned the attachments of some units to the Army of the Potomac, right? 2nd Vermont Brigade, 2 brigades of the Pennsylvania Reserves. They reorganized the 3rd Cav Division, but it's not as many men as you think. And one thing I discussed today was the relationship between Halleck and Hooker, which was never good. And by this point, I mean, it's broken. And so, he sends his chief of staff, Dan Butterfield, to D.C. to retrieve more troops. And that's why I think that account was so interesting, because Hooker tells them, go to Halleck, and if Halleck says no, go directly to Stanton and Lincoln, right? And that's what he does. Halleck says no. He goes directly to Lincoln, and Lincoln calls in Halleck. So it was like a double whammy, right? Like, we're not sending any more troops to you guys. So
now, do you think, I always got the feeling that Lincoln and Halleck were kind of making it hard for Hooker to do his job so that he'll resign. Is that like backed up by anyone, or does anybody else think that, or am I just reading into it?
Some historians have asserted that, and
they have. Okay.
I actually don't think it. I think it makes sense. I think it's certainly
seems
plausible.
Like they're like, you better make sure that we're covered, but you better go get Lee.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, can I have this? No, you can't. And then Meade takes over, and they're like, whatever you want.
Exactly. So, and that showed how much it changed, right? And because I know some historians have, I mean, that's one of the big issues is like the garrison at Harper's Ferry, right? Which is about 10,000 guys, right? And he's placed in command of those troops, by the way, right? And then so he gives the order. I'm trying to remember. Was it William French that was there? Was it William French that was there?
French was there. Yeah, French.
I think it was French,
Yeah.
right? So he gives an order to French to join the army. We need you. Got 10,000 fresh men. That's a lot,
Sure.
right? And Halleck countermands the order. And right after that happens, that's when he
resigns.
He offers his resignation, right? So as I was talking about Noah Andre Trudeau, who wrote a great book about the battle here.
Yeah,
and
that's my favorite.
We were talking, and I sent him these responses. I mean, these letters or messages from Hooker to Halleck and Hooker to Butterfield, and I'm like, so what do you think about this? He's just, and that's why I mentioned today, and I think he's spot on. He's like, he wanted command of more of the troops to be sent to his army, and he would like kind of offer his resignation out there to kind of force him to do something, right? Believing that they would reinforce him, and they called his bluff, right? And so they accepted it. Really interesting.
So, at any point during the Gettysburg campaign, are the forts now? You mentioned that there's a few brigades that leave, and
Sure.
Stahl's division becomes Kilpatrick's division.
That's right.
Are there any threats? Does Stuart threaten Washington in any way on his ride, or is there a scare of at least?
There was a mention of it. It's interesting. If you read anything about the D.C. forts, especially in Virginia, the person they're most freaked out about all the time is John Mosby.
Yeah.
So they're always thinking Mosby, is the ghost is just around it, right? He's just constantly around, and so they're really fearful of cavalry raids against the city, right? They might just break through the lines, and that actually makes sense. Think about that: 37 miles of earthworks. You can't have a guy there every single foot, right?
And Mosby's got what? Barely 100 men?
Yeah.
150.
The
at the
idea
most?
of him ever attacking the defenses is insane, right?
Yeah, well.
But there was movement, obviously. Jeb Stuart was around Washington, D.C.,
Right.
So, and Heitzman, the commander of the department, he writes about that. He writes about we're fearful that the Confederate cav might make a dash towards the city, So that was the closest threat, right? And he responded, I think, the best he could with the limited resources he had, especially in regards to horsemen. He sent out patrols and stuff like that, but there was only so much he could do, right?
Right.
And so, was there ever a really serious threat during the campaign? I don't believe so. I'm not from what I've read, but you can't tell that to the guys that are in the city at that time. They have no idea what's going on, right?
Of course. Yeah. All right. So then, I know you're pressed for time, so I want to move it along here. You later on in the war, was it 64 early, has a little assault there, right?
Yep.
Fort Stevens.
That's right. Yeah. He it's right after Manassas, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about the 64 campaigns, you see, I describe it as this, especially from the Union federal war perspective. I feel like starting with Grant and Lincoln, they're putting all the chips in the table, right? Mm-hmm. Because one of the things I've started researching is, because I did a program at Grant's Memorial outside of the Capitol building last year. I talked about Grant's arrival to D.C., right? And then he spends a couple of days there. Then he rides off to Virginia, and he visits George Meade, right? And then he spends a lot of time going between headquarters there and then going back to the city and conferring with Halleck and all this stuff. And one of the things he asked Halleck is like, tell me how many men are in the forts. Okay. He'll tell him, okay, there's that many men. How many can you spare from the forts? And beginning literally in March, April, May, April and May, they start stripping the forts, right? Uh-huh. And Lincoln approves.
Is it all at once or little by little?
It's actually more drastic than I originally thought. Okay. But at one point, they detach about 18,000 men. That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's an incredible amount of, right?
Out of how many are now at that point?
About maybe 30 or so thousand, but the number will increase up to about 25,000 men. As I said, and it's not just numbers, it's what they do.
Yeah.
When you start stripping the guys that are specifically trained to fire the really big guns, then you're going to have some issues, right?
And he strips them and puts them in the mixed infantry out of them.
That's right.
He doesn't they don't take heavy artillery down into Virginia. They just take the guys and turn them into infantry.
That's right. Well, because they were fresh reinforcements. Yeah. Especially after he really started sustaining heavy casualties at the start of the Overland campaign. And where are you going to look for fresh troops? Right. There are a ton of them in D.C., right? And so when they send these troops out, they'll replace them with National Guard troops. And we talk a lot about National Guard troops in 1864. The president calls out for more volunteers, and the state governors respond by, well, we're going to raise 100-day volunteers. 100 days. National Guard troops. That's it. So the ones that you see in D.C., a lot of them are like from Ohio, right?
Right.
100 days. Literally, that's it. Can you imagine 100 days? And so you've got, when the Confederate Army starts advancing towards D.C., at Fort Stevens, you've got the 150th Ohio National Guard. Company K is one of the units manning the fort. Mm-hmm. They're from Oberlin College. They're college students. It's insane, right? And so, and that's why they're scrambling to send up reinforcements from Virginia. They send up the 6th and 19th Corps from Petersburg. Well, the 19th Corps is coming from the Department of the Gulf, but they're on river transpots, but they just send them up to the city. So in many ways, it becomes a race. But one thing that I really wanted to kind of make a point of is kind of getting back to Early's report about this. I think there's a couple things that weigh in, right? He fights a major battle at Manassas on July 9th. He does not realize that he's running into elements of the Army of the Potomac, which is really important to understand.
Okay.
Because there's a division of the 6th Corps there under James Ricketts, and they arrive in Baltimore from the river, and they're transported by train out to the Manassas, area where Lew Wallace is making his grand stand, and they fight ferociously that day. And they hold, it's about an 8 to 10 hour fight. And so, Early's expecting to run into like home guards and stuff like that, which he does run into, but then he's like, oh my gosh, the Army of the Potomac is here. And he's like, how many more men are coming, right? So when he drives those guys actually off the field and they retreat towards Baltimore, he's got this one route towards D.C. and he takes it, right? And so it becomes a race in many ways. So Lew Wallace, makes the Confederate Army spend at least one full day in a major pitched fight. And then the weather's in the 90s and they're straggling all the way to Washington, D.C., which gets me back to I think one of the most important points is the forts. He doesn't know that they're lightly manned, right?
Who you say, Early?
Yeah. You see these really big forts, right? And by that point, the Federal High Command was like, oh my gosh, they're coming this way. Kind of what you were speaking about earlier. They were stripping the forts in Virginia to skeleton crews and sending those guys north. This is the famous, this is actually, because they did this in 62 and 63, but 64 is the time where government clerks are like really kind of under fire, right? They sign up like over 1,500 men under Montgomery Meigs. And if you live in D.C. or around D.C., like he's so popular, right? Because he designed the Capitol Dome and the National Building Museum, really important with Arlington, right? And all these cemetery lodges, including the one at my office. But he commands government clerks during this battle, so everyone is sent up to the front line. They empty hospitals, right? Because
you made that point before that they mustered in
whoever
anybody
could pick up a gun,
from the city.
They formed volunteer units. I mean, they did whatever they could because the forts were there. They just needed men, right? And that's why they wanted the heavies back, because they're like, we don't have enough guys that can operate these really big guns, right? So from what kind of determined and from the research I've done, Jubal Early's advance gets about 80 or so yards to Fort Stevens before they're driven back.
Okay.
That's pretty close.
And is this when Lincoln came out?
It is, indeed.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We believe he was out there both days. Okay. July 11th is when the initial Confederate advance happens. It's mostly skirmishing, right? They're trying to test out the strength of the forts. And we believe Lincoln's out there around noonish. And he gets the message that the 6th Corps has arrived off the wharf. And so he rides down there to greet the soldiers, right? And apparently it's a euphoric scene. And because they know veterans had arrived, and the populace is giving them food and and water and things like that. And my friend said this is one of my favorite dad jokes, and of course I got to use it. And this is when Lincoln tells the 6th Corps soldiers, you can't be late if you want early, and everyone's like laughing and stuff. At first I'm like, do they even know Early's in command? Because it was formerly Ewell's Corps, right?
Right.
And so for a lot of the campaign, they keep on referring to Ewell's on his way. But by July 5th or 6th, they actually start calling it Early's command.
Yeah, well, Elijah Hunt Rhodes says General Early was late.
That's right. That's right. So
that's the first dad joke. Or
exactly.
Another dad joke.
So it's really rooted in historical fact there, Steve. You don't have to use the dad joke cop-out. It's just source interpretation.
I wanted to make sure it was accurate. And so there was about a week that went by. I'm like, this can't. I don't think this happened. Then I started going through the reports again. I'm like, all right, yep, that happened.
Yeah.
So,
all right. And then before we let you go, tell us about the faces of the forts.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't officially launched the project yet. Look for this in February of 2020, so within the next few weeks. But the idea was, it really started with the public, right? I've done programs all over the place. I remember coming out to Gettysburg and doing a presentation at the Civil War Institute, doing one at the Winter Lecture Series here as well. And generally, every time I complete my program, there's always a couple people that come up and share family history.
Yeah.
You know, I had a so-and-so that served in this fort, ancestor, great-great-grandfather. There's someone in my family line, and I've got his documents. I've got an image of him. Would you like to do something with me? Yes, of course. You know, so I've been working on this project really for about 2 years, trying to kind of formulate how this would look. And the idea is what it's called, Faces of the Fort. So we want to create a story map on our website where people can participate. You know, they send the images to us, and if you do send an image, it does become public domain, so that there'll have to be permission that they sign a slip with that. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Because I get it. You know, this is personal information. You know, this is personal family history. You know, so I had to consider that. And we want everything digitized, right? So you can just send us a copy of it. And the idea is, if you go on a big map at DC and you say, hey, what's happening at Fort Lyon? You click on Fort Lyon. We've got images of the fort if we have them. Give you history of the fort, who was named after Nathaniel Lyon, of course. And then if there are profiles of the soldiers or biographies, you can click on an image and his bio will pop up.
I have an idea for that, but I'm not going to tell you on here.
Okay, I like that. I like ideas.
Top secret.
So, and then not just soldiers as well. There's accounts of civilians that worked at the forts, built them, helped build them, right? They're all around and selling, you know, so there's just so much stuff that we can talk about. There's African Americans formerly enslaved, contraband. There's freed. There's African American soldiers. There's convalescents. There's nurses. There's laborers, right? There's everything we can really talk about. And so we want to do this really big map at DC, and we want people to see kind of the human side of the war, right? You can click and learn more about this, and just imagine, you know, and if someone from California sends something in, it's like, look how far this has ranged out since the course of the war.
Or another country.
Yeah, absolutely. So cool. That's kind of the main gist of the program.
Because didn't you do something about Asians that worked around the forts?
Well, I've done stuff on, I was part of an MPS publication called Asian and Pacific Islanders in the Civil War, right? But I've been able to, like Joseph Pierce, who fought with the 14th Connecticut, right? People know, I know where he was at in D.C. So he was around I think he was actually at Fort Lyon, you know? So if you just kind of go through the regimental records of where these guys were at, because there was so much movement between the forts, right? Guys would come here for maybe a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, and they'd be sent to the front, or they could be here for 3 to 4 months or even a couple of years, right? So, and they've I'm hoping we can uncover some really insightful letters about the soldier experience or even the civilian experience in the war. And I'll share one really quick. I've got a great friend. He's a local historian, and actually his really good friend is Noah Andre Trudeau. And we've done programs together. And he went to the National Archives a couple weeks ago to research one of the forts, or the property owner specifically. Last name was Swart, over by Fort DeRussy, or the Rock Creek Park Nature Center. And this gentleman owned 90 acres of property before the war. Okay, 90 acres of property. I think 4 enslaved people. The Army used 88 acres of his land during the war. 88. Okay. You know, orchards cut down, whatever you have. If it's in the way, we're knocking it down. So I found the original letter. He penned a letter to Montgomery Meigs, the quartermaster general, and it's absolutely incredible because it talks about everything. He literally mentions military necessity like 3 or 4 times because he says, I understand military necessity. I get why you're doing this, but I don't ever believe that the government will ever pay me back for the damages being done here. He also mentions that there were soldiers and contraband cutting trees down. So that's like an account, obviously, of African Americans on the fort property, right? That's huge. And then he says, since I don't think you guys will ever pay for this in damages, because I don't think it'll ever cover the cost, I think you should start paying me rent for the land you use. And which is not uncommon. There was a fort off to the west that actually, I believe they had connections with someone in the government because they were able to get the government to to pay rent. But he wasn't paid rent, and he spent literally 20 years trying to get damages from the government.
Did he ever get it?
Twice. But
He got him twice?
But it was generally like, so let's say...
That's 2 times better than most other people.
True. But think about this. If they list if you say the damage is estimated at like 10 grand, they would give you like 3 or 2.
Yeah.
That was it. Yeah. So some people didn't get anything. Some people got some. So apparently he got a small sum, I think in the 1870s, and then he had to try again in the 1880s or 90s, or right before Rock Creek was established in 1890. So
if people have someone that was in the forts and they want to get it to you, how do they do that?
Well, there's a couple ways you can do that. That's a great question. I would say you can email me, first of all. My name is Steve Phan. My email is TUAN_PHAN@nps.gov. You can also just look for us on our website is just look up Civil War Defenses of Washington. It's an MPS page. Should be www.mps.gov/CWDW. Okay, and then you can reach us from there. And then I know my friends in the room do this. Just follow Instagram or our Facebook page, right?
Right.
If you look up Civil War Defenses, just look for the green arrowhead, the MPS arrowhead as our profile picture, and I manage the page, so people message me there all the time.
Okay.
Right. So I had a gentleman from that's been doing research on this Michigan regiment that. He sent me a look to his website. It was absolutely incredible. He had dozens of soldiers on there and all their profiles, right?
Cool.
So, that's why social media and the technology outreach is so important, right? We've had people come up to me and he's like, and it was for Park Day last year, and we did a cleanup at one of the forts, and he's like, hey, I saw this program on Instagram. I'm like, thank you. So it's working. It's reaching out.
Isn't it nice when you hear somebody that's like followed your stuff? And I'm always like, well, how did you hear about it? And it sounds like you're like so into yourself when you ask these questions, but really it's just to see what's effective and what's working. Yeah. Steve, you are fantastic.
I like it, Pete. Yes. Emphasis. Very.
And it was fun having you on. You have plans, and I don't want to keep you much longer. And we'll have you on again, though.
I hope to be back. I think you're doing a tremendous job. I think this type of outreach and the way you, this forum is really important. And you're always in the field, and you're going to different places and talking to different people, and that keeps history proactive. It keeps people connected, so I think you're doing an incredible job. So I'm very honored to be here. Thank you.
Well, we're honored to have you, and Cameron, you did a great job as well.
Yeah, thanks for letting me sit in.
I hope we'll be hearing more of you on the show. Bob, as always, you are a stalwart companion. And
thanks, Steve. Thanks, Cameron.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. Appreciate being here.
Thanks to all the rest of you, all of our patrons, for being Patreon patrons, and we'll talk to you next time.
Cheers.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Awesome. Nice.